Frantz Fanon, the socio-political psychiatrist and anti-colonialist intellectual whose name still resonates in the fight against dehumanizing racism, grew up in Martinique, studied in France, and practiced psychiatry in North Africa. His experience instilled in him the stance that colonization, with its underlying racism, is a great purveyor of psychiatric hospitals. Let's see a brief reference to Fanon's Itinerary. Landing in metropolitan France, driven by patriotic and humanist ideals at the age of 18, Fanon experienced racism while he had voluntarily engaged in the struggle against German occupation. He told his friend Marcel Manville, quote, « Chaque fois que la dignité et la liberté de l'homme sont en question, nous sommes concernés, blancs, noirs ou jaunes. Et chaque fois qu'elles seront menacées en quelque lieu que ce soit, je m'engagerai sans retour. » I translate, whenever man's dignity and freedom is in question, we are all concerned, white, black, or yellow. And whenever they will be threatened anywhere, I would be committed without turning back. In the newly liberated France, however, Fanon soon discovered that he was objectified as a Negro by the white gaze. For metropolitan French people of that time who were victims of color prejudice, the Negro, between quotation marks, represented an almost animal being, associated with paradoxical cliches of sexual predation, savagery, merriness, and meekness. Fanon's early encounter with racism, which has initiated his reflection on racial injustice, continued during his military service under the French banner in colonial Algeria, where he witnessed the ordeals of its native population. In 1953, Fanon was appointed head of Blida-Joinville Hospital's Department of Psychiatry in Algeria, where he discovered the bleak face of the French civilizing mission. He developed a clinical commitment to treat the victims of the racist system he personally had suffered from, albeit to a lesser degree in his native Martinique. He was stunned by the poverty of the indigenous population whose humanity was denied while the colonial system plundered the country's resources. When the Algerian War of Independence broke up, Fanon became one of its fervent defenders. He joined the Front of National Liberation and treated wounded soldiers. He decided to quit his job at the hospital because he found it impossible to practice medicine in a place of, quote, systematized dehumanization, end of quote. In the letter to the resident minister, he revealed his sense of guilt for serving in an institution of, quote, systematized dehumanization, end of quote. He languished that psychiatry, a discipline that should reconcile patients with their environment, strived to alienate the colonized in their own country, causing them to live in, quote, absolute depersonalization, end of quote. His active involvement in the War of Independence caused his deportation from Algeria in 1957. Fanon's critique of scientific racism. Colonial medicine considered the etiology of African primitivism, between quotation marks, as innate. In other words, it advances that human behavior is controlled by genes or some other biological component. In this genetic or biological determinist view, the mental disturbance of native populations are simply their fate. Colonial medicine attributed the failure of the health system in any colony to an issue in the native community, like an innate biological structure or rigid attachment to cultural tradition. Reflecting on the particular context of Algeria, Fanon argued that, quote, Western medical science was one of the most tragic characteristics of the oppressive system because it was introduced at the same time as racialism and humiliation, end of quote. Colonial medicine relied on scientific racism to essentialize the colonized behavior as determined by an innate inferiority in their brain structure. While a fully developed frontal cortex governed the Europeans' behavior, the Algiers School of Psychiatry assumed the diencephalon, that is, quote, one of the most primitive parts of the brain, end of quote, govern the Algerians' behavior. Their cerebral structure was allegedly responsible for their laziness, quote, mental and social aptitude, as well as their virtual animal impulsiveness, end of quote. Antoine Porot, the father of the Algiers School of Psychiatry, drew a grim portrait of the Algerians as violent beings by heredity, born with congenital compulsivity and aggressiveness that usually took the form of homicide, as opposed to Europeans who usually committed suicide under melancholic conditions. The English School of Colonial Psychiatry was embodied by John Colin Carruthers, who presented a report to the World Health Organization entitled The African Mind in Health and Disease, a Study in Ethno-Psychiatry in 1953. In this report, adult Africans were depicted as children with an elevated level of emotional lability and inability to grow up, which was comparable to lobotomized Europeans. Furthermore, colonial psychiatry indicated that Africans, quote, tended to be psychotic rather than neurotic, with a tendency towards schizophrenia rather than depressive disorders, while manic depression required a strong sense of personal responsibility, a quality originating in European culture, end of quote. Such claims on racial differences in psychiatric disorders were appended by scientific racism and craniology, which, since the 17th century to the middle of the 20th century, claimed empirical results to justify racial differences. Racism-induced nervous conditions. In his foreword to The Wretched of the Earth, Jean-Paul Sartre considered that, quote, the status of native is a nervous condition introduced and maintained by the settler among colonized people with their consent, end of quote. Fanon objected to the advocacy of genetic determinism in mental illness, and without neglecting its partial biological etiology, observed the equal importance of the sociogeny, which means the social genesis of mental illness. In the colony, according to him, madness was predominantly a pathology of freedom, between quotation marks, and alienation from the environment. Transcultural therapy. While still a psychiatry resident, Fanon noted that, quote, the prognosis is in the hands of those who are willing to get rid of the worm-eaten roots of the structure, end of quote. The word structure refers to the racist colonial status quo whose subversion would ease the nervous conditions caused by colonial oppression. Starting from the premise that, quote, the biological, the psychological, the sociological were only separated by an aberration of the mind, end of quote, Fanon and Azoulay decided to practice social therapy or sociotherapy at Blida-Joinville Hospital in Algeria. Fanon had learned this therapeutic method from François Tosquel at Saint-Alban Hospital in France. It consists in establishing a miniature society inside the psychiatric ward, and it involves the treatment of the institution before the treatment of the patient. The other name for this was institutional psychotherapy. Social therapy attempts to reduce stress factors in the hospital and provides the opportunity of sociability to the inmates by encouraging them to take some responsibilities. This innovative method initially failed in the Muslim men's pavilion because the latter would find no interest in the activities, and the meetings would take place in absolute silence or in general brouhaha and brawl. Fanon, with his intern, Azoulay, observed that work therapy, which is part of social therapy, did not interest inmates because the notions of work in the French metropolis and the Algerian colony were different. Asking Algerian farmers to weave baskets, for instance, could not yield results because they perceived it as a feminine task. Theater, games, and choral evenings were also rejected because they were not part of the local culture. Fanon and Azoulay understood that they had fallen into the trap of Western psychiatry by presupposing the universality of therapeutic practices. They had overlooked the principle of cultural relativism that consists in understanding the traditions and values of the local society. Accordingly, they started thinking about ways to graft St. Alban's social therapy on the local context. It was a pioneering reflection in transcultural psychiatry. They selected a battery of activities that could capture the inmates' interest, like gardening, maintenance, football, and the Moorish cafe with local music. They equally considered the importance of religion for their patients and asked the Mufti, which means Muslim priest, to visit the psychiatric department on a regular basis, followed by storytellers and finally an orchestra to rehabilitate the patients through music. Hence, even though social therapy was not a panacea for mental issues, it, quote, reactivates delusional and hallucinatory processes. It provokes new dramatizations and enables the doctor to understand better what may have happened outside. End of quote. This groundbreaking experiment momentarily transformed the psychiatric ward at Blida Hospital into a small social milieu with empowering human relations and responsibilities. New Humanism. Humanism, which does not discriminate between human beings because of their race, can be observed at both ends of Fanon's short but seminal writing career. In the first page of his first piece of writing, Black Skin, White Masks, he declared his intention to write, quote, for a new humanism, end of quote. In the last page of his final piece of writing, The Wretched of the Earth, he concluded, quote, for Europe, for ourselves, and for humanity, comrades, we must make a new start, develop a new way of thinking, and endeavor to create a new man, end of quote. To conclude, Fanon's reflections are still valid today, mainly because of his concept of epidermalization or internalization of inferiority that still plagues former colonized peoples, roughly 70 after their flag independence. His thought also remains topical in the current anti-racist and anti-imperialist struggles around the world. For example, his numerous uses of the word breathe is a useful tool to study George Floyd's death cry, I can't breathe, and the Black Lives Matter movement. In Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon wrote, quote, I have to throw off an attacker who is strangling me because I literally cannot breathe, end of quote. And in A Dying Colonialism, he concluded that, quote, under these conditions, the individual's breathing is an observed and occupied breathing. It is a combat breathing. He often used similar words like suffocated and smothered to depict the experience of the oppressed and the need for combat breathing to put an end to racist dehumanization.